All right. Well, it is 3:30 here on a Wednesday afternoon, and it is time for another webinar in our Survive and Thrive series. So thank you all for joining us again here today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ryan Weissmuller. I am the president of Fintrepid Solutions. We partner with primarily founder-led entrepreneurial businesses, helping them along their evolutionary journey. We've worked with over 80 companies to date, and certainly working with a number right now, helping them navigate these very challenging times. So certainly we keep our ear very close to the ground on what is happening out there, and have certainly seen and been able to take away some good best practices, which will be part of what we share with you here today. One quick update, I just mentioned this by way of an announcement for some of you who are regular attendees. Gotten some interesting feedback, and we're actually going to be sending out some announcements on some different forms of content we're going to be doing coming along. We will certainly continue the Survive and Thrive series, but maybe on a little bit different schedule, but have had some requests to do a little bit more focused topical content as well. So again, we'll keep these tight, keep them impactful, but just keep an eye out for those announcements, and certainly looking forward to continuing to provide some good information for you all in the future. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in. And seemingly like it's been every time we do this, information hot off the press is even same day. So a lot to talk about today. Again, for those of you who heard me before, there are some themes that I see all the time. And I think the one thing I will put out there, and had an issue where this came up again this morning, is there is no one size fits all plan for anyone. Had a client who actually heard something that a fellow business did, kind of a peer CEO. Very good for that peer CEO, not so good for our client. So really understanding how everything impacts your business, your situation, supremely important. But we're going to try to give you some pragmatic information, some good tips to walk away with, some actionable information, because certainly there is a lot of information floating out there. We want to focus on what to do with it, and some actionable steps to take. So with that, our agenda, we'll talk through quickly what's going on in the market. Certainly lots of movements there, relief options, and a lot of updates on that front as well. And then again, what we like to end it is, what do we all do as a result of all this? So jumping in. First off, in terms of what's happening, and wow, there's a reason our title this week was still on the roller coasters. It seems like we've been on that roller coaster for a long time. There are seemingly on a daily, hourly basis, dueling headlines. So, certainly we had some great economic news. We've had not so great economic news. We have good COVID news. We have not so great COVID news. There is no shortage of information flying out there, economic and other. And, the best thing there is, and certainly what we try to do, is just try and stay even keel and pragmatic about all of it, and try to filter through the noise a little bit. But it is very challenging. Are we in the second wave? Is this just an expansion of the first wave of the coronavirus? A few updated piece of information I did see is now in the U.S. we've tested just under 25 million people, and the positive test rate is down now below 9%. That was much higher than that for a period of time. That's some good news, but we also have states spiking, like where I am in Arizona. And again, all signs point that this is just a continuation of that first wave, but we don't know. We can't predict it. Certainly there's been good news this week with vaccines. Johnson & Johnson rapidly sped up human trials of one of their vaccines. They're saying they'd have 200 million doses ready by, I believe, the end of the year. And then there was some treatment news that came out, where actually a study, I believe from Oxford in England, there's a widely available steroid that can actually greatly reduce death from the disease. So positive news, negative news. It's very hard, and I feel like our world is a little bit schizophrenic right now. So just, it is what it is. Try to stay as even keel as possible, and I don't expect that trend to cease. Now, as far as the consumer, and I will take a little bit more good news out of this front to share, and kind of looking at, again, some key data, not opinions. So consumer spending was up a record amount, nearly 18% in May. Just like the unemployment numbers, I think there was a little bit of surprise that it was as early as it happened for it to snap back that quickly. That is good news in that the consumer is spending. Now the key to watch is that sustainable and does it sustain? Along with that, department store spending has ticked up materially. So all spending is rising, but even department store spending, because if you recall in the early days of this, there was a lot of discount store spending, grocery spending. Seeing department store spending on what are more, disposable goods, discretionary goods, that's very promising. And then the other key piece is if you look at, there was one small blip, but if you look at weekly trends of mortgage applications for new home purchases, they have been increasing, which is a good sign. Now, there's a lot that can still move on all this. Certainly, what is going on with, the tragic things that we're seeing across our country that are occurring, with a lot of these unfortunate events with police and victims and the riots, certainly what we've seen going on with up in the Pacific Northwest. I mean, it is a very scary, dangerous time, a lot of good people being hurt, and not a lot of answers. So all bets are still off. There's still a lot of directions things could move. And it's still a challenging time to navigate. No question about that. And I would not try to make light of that in any sense. Suffice it to say, just as much as possible, avoiding the information overload. One tip that actually somebody gave me is read the news once a day, which is not a bad piece of advice. The other, a few big trends that we've seen, I think these are important to highlight. We've seen this both locally as well as there's global trends around this. So one is there is a lot of anxiety around the workforce. So many offices have reopened. I know of a couple businesses that have actually reopened and had COVID cases. There is lots of hesitation on the part of the workforce. There are folks who, even that were laid off and are still hesitant to come back to work, again, because those unemployment benefits, that extra incentive on the unemployment still runs through the end of July. But there's fear out there. There's fears of reclosing. And really you're seeing that some folks probably are going to end up working from home or working in a more of a flex situation for a period of time. And some of them really want that. So that is definitely transpiring on a micro and a macro scale. The other thing that we're seeing, and this has really just started to trickle down from what we see in our purview in the last couple of weeks, banks are starting, some banks are starting to tighten the reins a little bit. I was actually expecting that this was going to happen a little bit earlier in the process. It did not, but we are starting to see some banks tighten up a little bit as far as new opportunities, still working with existing customers. But something to bear in mind that new financing, at least for a period of time, it seems like there's a little bit of a wait and see around COVID, wanting to see some numbers leveling off a little bit perhaps. And even the broader question, and this is a question I've asked of a number of banks myself, how are you looking at a company in the COVID environment? How do you evaluate 2020? There's no good concrete answers that I found on this yet. There's a lot of folks trying to kind of process through and think through creative solutions and rationalize that, but that is still an unknown. So something to definitely be aware of. A couple other key points on Main Street, which we also always like to point out as well. One thing that is definitely happening, and you may have heard the term zombie companies. I can't remember if I've used it before or not. But examples of zombie companies, I would say JCPenney. Companies that have been around, that were maybe buoyed a little bit by the overall strength of the economy pre-COVID, that you're starting to see COVID be something of the final nail in the coffin. There's also companies that got PPP money that may have just bought them a little bit more time, but not enough time to ultimately survive or certainly to thrive. So you are starting to see some of those companies really struggle, really fail, pull back, shrink, etc. And that's going to continue, we think, to have some widespread impacts. Certainly the other thing is, and we'll talk about the PPP changes, but really for most companies out there, they're either close to or at the end of that PPP window. What the post-PPP environment looks like, for companies that have spent all that money, where are they at now? And how strong are they? Have they been able to hold off and get to a position of greater strength? Did it just buy time? Jury's still very much out. We are seeing sale opportunities on the cheap, seen it on both sides. I've seen some companies going out and trying to buy very cheap and actually getting some takers, and also seeing companies that are willing to exit on the cheap as well. So that will continue to be out there. And I think the other piece, just to be mindful of it, I think last time we talked, I used the used the phrase that move because the competition that is definitely happening there, and even more so in the last couple of weeks. There are companies that are being very opportunistic with this, that have pivoted, figured things out, that are going to make it, coming at things from a position of strength. So you need to be aware that very well could be happening in your industry, and in all likelihood is. So with that, let's jump to our small business relief. And wow, there is a lot of information here. And it does feel like we're getting closer to answers on a lot of fronts, but I will say it again, the information is still changing. There were some updates today that I will share with you. But for most companies, I think most of what's happening is good news. So let's start out with PPP. Some big changes. So the law, the PPP Flexibility Act, was signed into law. A few things that come out of that. So number one, the 8 weeks to use the money was extended to 24. Also, the ratio, if you recall, you had to use 75% of the funds on payroll and 25% on non-payroll. That's now been shifted to 60-40. There's also a new simplified forgiveness application. That's something that came out today. So depending on how your business is structured, there's even a simplified version of the simplified forgiveness application. One is 5 pages, one is 3. Literally just came out today. I had a chance to scan through them. Looks fairly self-explanatory, no huge surprises that jumped out at me. But again, the reminder, your bank may have their own version. Certainly a lot of banks are doing electronic submittals of PPP, so just something to be aware of. I wouldn't rush to go out and fill that form out today. Not a bad idea to look at it and run some calculations, but just something to be aware of. The other important change I want to talk to that applies to the Act as well is previously there was the payroll tax credit that could be taken for companies that did not have a PPP loan. What the Act did is actually now you can double dip. And so for companies with W-2 employees, you can take a credit, or a deferral, not a credit, a deferral of payroll taxes. That is an option now into 21 and 22, even if you got the PPP loan. So not a credit, a deferral. But certainly an option for companies that are trying to preserve some cash flow right now and buy a little bit more time. So that is one of those things I would definitely recommend. Talk to your CPA. Does it make sense? Does it not? But just understand, by deferring, you're still leaving that bogey out there down the road. So something to be mindful of. And the open question still is tax deductibility. And what I am hearing, because the Act did not address this, of whether expenses that were forgiven would be tax deductible. Our expectation is that there's still a decent chance something happens there. Not counting on it, but there is still some pressure on Wall Street, in Washington, and in some bipartisan support potentially to make that, or even at a certain level, to make that deductible. So something to watch closely and see. And one just common misconception that I will point out. One other thing that changed in the Act was the time period of the loans, or the term of the loans. So the original loans were terms of 2 years. The Act changed it to 5. However, and this is important, that is only for new issued loans after the date of the Act. So if you got your PPP loan in April or May, it is not automatic. Now, we are told that banks are renegotiating this, extending it out to 5 years potentially. Based on our read of everything going on, I don't know how much I would count on that. And for this reason, I've said this before, banks want these off their balance sheets. They don't want a loan sitting out there for 5 years. The 24 weeks really for most companies should provide a pretty high level of forgiveness unless there's been massive changes to the business. So, something very close to look at, but from what we're seeing, we would certainly plan on just holding it the 2 years if that's what you have now. The other good news with the 24 weeks, and again, understanding, you can apply for forgiveness at any time. After the 8, you can wait for the full 24. I think really just a question of whether you've used the funds. But again, that's going to be bank by bank. So have that conversation with your lender that you got the PPP from. And my guess is, I've actually seen it already from a couple of our clients where they sent out, banks, their lenders sent out some updates, probably getting some updates from their lenders as all this transpires. The other big change on the relief side is the Main Street Lending Program. So this has gained a lot of steam over the last week or so. Now, one caveat I will say is that not all banks are participating. That much we know, but it is launching. It is not clear exactly which banks are launching it. And also the time of the launch is going to be bank by bank as well. If you recall with the PPP, same thing. Some banks came out of the gate faster than others. So important to talk to your bank. Are they participating? Are they not? My guess is there's going to be some marketing or some materials around who's in it and who's not, and that certain banks will be putting that out there. A couple big changes too that occurred. One is they took the minimum loan amount down to now $250,000 to $250,000. It was at $500,000. So they're now trying to make this plan or this program available to even more companies. The other thing is that it's now a 5-year loan. It was 4 before. So what we are hearing, it's a 5-year loan with 2 years of payment deferrals, and then there is a fairly quick amortization after that. So just to be aware of it. But it's a multiple of EBITDA. There are, and again, this is where the fine print is going to be very, very interesting. There are some restrictions and limitations. There are some limitations around owner compensation. There's some limitations around distributions, limitations around other debt and what the funds can be used for. And the other big key to remember, unlike the PPP, this is a bank underwritten loan. So the bank is going to go through, they're going to look at EBITDA, they're going to understand your balance sheet, they're going to look at different areas of your company and come up with what they feel is a comfortable level based on that. There's guidelines. This is not a hard and fast like the PPP where it's 2.5 times a month of payroll. So have conversations with the bank. We do think very strongly that this is going to be extremely beneficial for some companies out there. For others, it's not going to apply. At least be an effective option. So certainly case by case like so many things, but it is at least positive that more options are coming to the table. And then the other update, the EIDL loans, so the emergency injury disaster loans, that actually opened back up, I believe either a day ago or 2 days ago, where they are accepting applications again. That was kind of quietly closed a while back. A couple things we know. The max amount that you can get under the loan is $150K. And they are still offering the $10,000 grant up front. Now, the timing to process is still a little bit fluid. For some companies out there, this can be a great benefit. And certainly, you know, we're advising certain companies to go ahead and proceed with it. You know, the terms are pretty favorable. Now, where you do have to be aware is the impact if you are adding new debt, looking to add new debt. That's where there can be a little bit of a wrinkle. So certainly each situation unique. It's not for everybody out there. And for some companies, $150,000 really is not going to make much of a dent, but at least good news that there is another option. It does also seem highly likely that there is going to be a round 4 of the stimulus. So something to keep an eye on there. There are a lot of things that have been talked about. You've probably heard of some of them. Travel credits, some other small business potential aid, certain areas. We don't know where this is going to go. I don't even want to try and guess. And quite frankly, with everything I've read, there are so many options being discussed. I think that is very much up in the air. But it does seem like there is sizable momentum that we are going to see something. So pay attention there. And the best thing I would tell you is just try to stick to the facts and what you see, because you can certainly get a lot of opinions on what's in some of these and whether it's good or not. So a lot there, a lot of updates around that. So let's now turn it to what do we do? And I think the first thing, and not to be overly, overly draconian with this, but the first thing is looking at the brutal facts of where things sit today. So in your business, we're post PPP or pretty darn close to it. Where are you? What's happening in your business? What's happening with sales? What's happening with employees? What adjustments are you making to that plan that you set a few weeks, a month, 6 weeks ago? Really taking, peeling back the onion and really looking at what is happening is critically important, because we're far enough away from some of this COVID impact that we've started to see some trends. Are they sustaining trends? We don't know. But the point is there is activity. Consumers are buying, there's movement, the economy slowly is reopening back up. So what is happening? What's in your business? And really taking that brutally candid lay of the land right now is very important based on what based on what you're seeing. Number two, and again, going into the PPP is just what does cash flow look like? So the PPP is largely gone. You are probably with these changes feeling better about forgiveness, because that was certainly something that had a lot of companies very uneasy, understandably so. What does the future look like? Really understanding that cash flow post PPP, and looking at maybe a case that your cash balances are actually sitting pretty today, but looking out through the rest of the year, that might start to dwindle if there's a lot more cash going out the door and not able to offset it. So that post PPP cash flow, really, really important. We've talked about trying to get your cash flow. I mean, certainly at least 90 days, but wherever possible, cash flow to the end of the year. What does it look like? I don't think anybody's expecting. I know there's been talk about the rocket ship coming back, but for most businesses on Main Street, some industries not included, for most industries on Main Street, it's going to take a little time for things to come back. So understand what kind of resources you have and what kind of rope you have to work with to get there. Taking advantage of the reopening, and this is something we've seen companies do, as I mentioned, and the fact is, we are in the midst of reopening, not fully reopened, but in the midst. Where are there opportunities to take advantage of this? It is a time where you can be a little bit more direct in reaching out, potentially to customers. People are answering the phones again. People are in the offices again, at least in parts. Is it a time for promotions? Is it a time for connecting creatively? There may be some pent-up demand on your customer or by your customer that you can take advantage of. It may only be short-term, but if you're able to take advantage of some pent-up demand, and again, help manage that cash flow, help buy some more time as this slowing or this recovery slowly takes effect, that can be a great option. So understanding certainly if it's short-term versus long-term, you don't want to make a bank on it that it's going to continue, but understanding how you take advantage of what's happening out there right now with the economy in this state of reopening. And then lastly is, what are the numbers telling you? We are, we're far enough through this. Like I said, we're in mid-June. We've certainly seen companies, clients of ours that learned some very interesting things from their May numbers. Maybe already some early numbers in June. What are those numbers telling you? What are you seeing in trends? For a lot of companies right now, weekly trends are a very healthy idea. Some companies are doing a lot better than expected. We've seen some companies that had a little bit of a blip right out of the gate and then flattened. Some have not had much of an impact at all. So really looking in, understanding those numbers, what is that telling you? What does that look like? In times like this, and I will tell you, even some of the most respected economists we look at, they are looking at things in narrower time frames than they normally would, just because of how quick things change. So looking at weekly trends, if you have the ability to get that information, look at it. And if there's some numbers out there that are really important that you don't have really at your fingertips, figure out a way to do it, because that may ultimately be a make or break on some decisions. It's going to help you get to the next level and keep things moving along in a positive way. So lastly, to wrap it up, and then I did get a couple of questions in that I'll address, and certainly if anyone has anything else, go ahead and use that Q&A bar in your Zoom window there. First takeaway, again, I bring this up, but your business. Look locally, and I don't mean that you've got blinders on everything else going on in the world, but look locally, not globally. There is so much noise out there, so much confusion, so much interjection, that it's easy to take some global themes and apply it to your world, and it may or may not make sense. So, delving into and away from as much of that noise as you can, focusing on what is the impact on your business, what are you seeing, what's happening with your customer, because quite frankly, I know I talked today about retail trends. Just because retail sales are up doesn't mean retail sales are up for your business, for example. So really understanding that, trying to, again, what is that data telling you? How can you assess what's going on? And global headlines may or may not directly impact your business. It's good to take these things into account. Some of it could be perhaps leading indicators, but it's no guarantee that it's going to affect you in the same way. Revisiting and revising your operating plan. So by now, hopefully you've taken the time to develop a good plan. That plan may have moved a few times already, but again, for the reasons we talked about with having a little bit more post-COVID visibility, revisit it, revise it, talk to your team. What does it look like? What if these cases continue to spike? What if there is an eventual second wave? What does that look like? now's a very good time to plan around that. Understand what the triggers are that you're looking for. We've got a client that we were just working with the other day where we're setting triggers. As they see certain sales number, that's going to be their trigger to go out and hire more people, but they're doing it very slowly and very methodically. That's a great example and a very good approach. So keeping a close eye on that plan, where does it need to be tweaked a little bit, and just keeping that in the back of your mind as things continue to evolve, hugely important. We talked about it. Where's the opportunity? What can you do right now to take advantage of things? Is there an opportunity perhaps to buy inventory cheap that somebody wants to liquidate? Is there a customer opportunity out there that someone's neglecting? What options do you have? And it is a question of how fast, how big this recovery is, but to some extent it may not matter. And we've talked about this before. I brought up the example of the zombie companies. There were some interesting statistics I was looking at. It was just one study that was put out there, but it seems like a lot of the news is focused on getting back to where we were. Well, if a lot of zombie companies disappear, especially in your space, you may pick up more market share when the overall economy is still not back where it was. So there is a ton of opportunity out there right now, especially if you're stronger than the guy next to you. Kind of the old adage, if you're trying to outrun a bear, just make sure you're not the slowest one in the group. There is opportunity, and we expect to continue to see that. And again, companies are taking advantage of it right now. And then lastly, the people side of it. This is what has been very interesting. As I said, we've seen some impact from this just in the last week with the spike in cases, certainly with the concerns over treatments and the vaccine still being a little ways off. What does the people side of things look like? And you may be staring a situation with your company where we're looking at some form of remote workforce, possibly at the end of the year, possibly beyond that. What does that look like? How does that impact the business? Are there additional costs? Are there things that you need to change in the way certain things are done? It's a key consideration. Understanding that impact, knowing what you can do, knowing how you can move those levers around, really, really important. It certainly is. And so, that is something that we would really encourage taking a look at and incorporating that with that overall operating plan. So with that covers all the planned content we had. Again, if you have any questions, fire those in. And if we go a few minutes over, that's okay. But you guys are always great about submitting some questions ahead of time, and certainly appreciate the feedback, because believe me, it makes my life a little bit easier. So one of the questions that was brought up, an easy one to address, was around the PPP applications, the forgiveness applications. As I said, there is an application. It's posted. The SBA and Treasury have released it. That should be considered pretty final, but again, I would hold off in terms of taking any action until talking to your bank. They're going to, the banks, it's very clear, are leading the process. But do bear in mind, for loans over $2 million, we've talked about this. You are guaranteed to have a further SBA review for any PPP loan over $2 million. So an important consideration. But that's one thing out there. Definitely have the conversation with the bank. The other thing that came up was just the question of the various options in combination with each other. And so here's what we know. The EIDL, and you'll see this right on the PPP app. The EIDL and the PPP, those two, there can be some conflict between those two. So again, the key there is you can't use the proceeds for the same thing. So that is something individualistically you'd have to look at. With the Main Street Lending Program, that actually can operate regardless of what you've done. So you can have a PPP loan and a Main Street Lending Program loan. That is not a problem. Those two can operate alongside themselves very, very well. Again, the key, just like I said with the PPP and the forgiveness, talk to your lender, because there's going to be some considerations. Even if you're eligible and even if the math works, a Main Street lending loan might not make sense for your specific company. Does the EIDL loan? It seems like for a number of companies, it could be a very nice option right now. For others, it's not going to be worth the hassle. And again, that can create some problems with other financing. So it's not to say, certainly a lot of these programs in of themselves can operate at the same time, but is that the best course of action? And I think that's really where I'd leave it, is that may or may not make sense. So just something to keep a very, very close eye on. So I don't see any other questions that have come in. Those were the two that came up during the course of the week. We will certainly be keeping a very close eye on things, trying to keep everyone informed. And again, keep an eye out for some additional notices on some additional sessions that are going to be coming up. We're still finalizing the date of our next Survive and Thrive session, and to some extent, I'm waiting to see what happens with where some of these shoes fall, because we'd like to be able to give you some more information on the Main Street program, get a little bit further along on PPP forgiveness, and be able to provide some better insights there. So stay tuned for that. We will keep you in the loop. And as always, thank you so much for taking a little bit of your afternoon and spending it with us. Hopefully you found this impactful. Stay safe, stay healthy. We'll talk soon. Take care.